Imagine this: someone standing before a mirror, not to admire who they are, but to search for approval in their reflection. Not depth, just validation. A smile rehearsed. A gaze hollowed by performance. Every movement calculated to evoke admiration, not connection. And yet, beneath that perfectly curated image lies something fractured, a soul too terrified to be seen, yet desperate not to be forgotten. This isn't self-love. It's survival masked as confidence. And what we call narcissism isn't vanity at all. It's a wound, a profound, unspoken, festering wound that many never dare to look at directly. Narcissism isn't about arrogance. It's about absence, the absence of a real self. A self that was never seen, never validated, never loved without condition. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Narcissism is that unconscious shadow, the one that manipulates, craves, performs not to hurt others, but to avoid the pain of being invisible, the pain of never having been enough. So they create a mask, a polished one that shines in rooms, captivates with charm, commands with charisma. But the tragedy? That mask becomes the prison, and the mirror, once a window for truth, becomes a stage for illusion. Because when a person spends their entire life trying to be admired, they forget how to be real. And when you forget how to be real, you lose the very thing that could have healed you. This chapter begins not with judgment, but with understanding. Because narcissism isn't the disease, it's the symptom. A response to pain so deep, even the narcissist can't name it. They just act, control, manipulate, perform, anything but feel. Because feeling means facing that terrifying truth. They don't know who they are without applause, and that is the mirror they fear most. But healing begins not in admiration, but in awareness. And awareness, Jung taught us, starts in the shadow. So let's go there not to judge, but to see. Because only what is seen can be transformed. Here's the most painful paradox of narcissism. The person who seems obsessed with themselves is actually the one most disconnected from who they really are. What you see isn't love, it's a desperate performance. And not for joy, for survival. The narcissist doesn't love themselves, they can't, because love requires presence, and presence demands truth, but their truth was buried long ago. Replaced by something shinier, safer, more acceptable. Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the world. It's not inherently wrong, we all have one. But when the persona becomes the only face we show, the real self withers beneath it. And that's the tragedy of the narcissist. Their entire identity becomes the performance. They don't just play the role, they become it. Perfect, untouchable, impressive. But behind that glittering mask is a child who learned that authenticity wasn't safe, that being real meant rejection. So, they split. They traded vulnerability for validation, depth for dominance, connection for control, and in doing so, they abandoned the very self that once longed to be held. Narcissism is not about having too much ego. It's about having a fragile ego, so fragile it must be constantly fed, or it collapses. That's why admiration becomes oxygen, why criticism feels like annihilation. Because without the applause, without the spotlight, they don't know who they are. They've lived so long in the echo of others' approval, they forgot the sound of their own voice. Jung understood this, that what we repress doesn't disappear, it festers in the dark. The narcissist's grandiosity isn't confidence, it's compensation. A way to silence the inner emptiness that screams when the room grows quiet. They love being seen because they are terrified of being known. Real intimacy, it's unbearable. Because real love sees through the mask, and when you've spent a lifetime hiding behind it, being seen can feel like death. So they perform instead, and each performance takes them further from themselves. That's not self-love, that's self-abandonment. And until that cycle is broken, until the persona is dropped and the shadow embraced, they will keep searching for themselves in other people's eyes and never find what they're truly looking for. Because what they're really searching for is themselves. Every narcissist was once a child. And not just any child, a deeply sensitive one. One who looked into their parents' eyes not for admiration, but for recognition, for safety, for love. But what they found instead was absence, or pressure, or a mirror that didn't reflect them, but projected someone else's need. Jung said it best: the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents, and that burden becomes unbearable when the child's own self is never allowed to emerge. Instead, they become what is expected. They adapt, they perform, they twist themselves into shapes that earn approval, not because they want to, but because survival depends on it. The seeds of narcissism are often planted in the invisible soil of emotional neglect, not always abuse. Sometimes it's just the absence of unconditional presence, a parent who loved conditionally, a home where emotions were inconvenient, a childhood where being good meant being quiet, impressive, obedient, never authentic. So the child learns, I am loved only when I am useful, only when I shine, only when I fulfill someone else's dream. And with every performance, the real self, the tender, messy, needing part, is buried just a little deeper. What emerges isn't arrogance. It's armor. What looks like control is really protection. Narcissism, at its core, is not a choice. It is a defense. A brilliantly tragic survival strategy crafted by a child who never learned that they were enough as they were. So they built something else, a mask, a role, a mirror designed to reflect only what others want to see. But beneath that is still the same child, frozen in time, still waiting for someone to come back and say, I see you, all of you, and it's okay. But that moment never came. So they never stopped pretending. And that's the wound that never healed, the one that keeps performing for love that feels forever out of reach. To survive, they became someone else. Not because they wanted to, but because the world made it clear that being real wasn't safe. So they crafted a version of themselves that could be loved. A version that could be praised, admired, even envied. But not known, never truly known. This is the false self. A carefully engineered identity built from everything others seem to value: beauty, intelligence, charm, status, strength. But all of it constructed over a void they hoped no one would ever find. Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, exile. The shame, the need, the fear, the pain. Narcissists don't destroy their shadow, they bury it beneath perfection. They become masters of the mask. But masks have weight, and the heavier they become, the more the real self disappears beneath them. What the world sees is someone in control, confident, charismatic, magnetic. But what lives inside is a soul starved of authenticity. A person terrified that if they ever stopped performing, no one would stay. So they keep going, smiling when they're numb, boasting when they feel empty, dominating when they're scared. And the worst part? It works. The world claps. Social media applauds. People orbit around the shine, never suspecting that what they're seeing is just the surface of a deep, unspoken grief. Because the false self can gain everything: success, followers, attention, except what it truly needs: to be seen without the mask, to be held in the truth of one's rawness. But for someone who's lived behind that mask their whole life, the idea of dropping it feels like death, like disappearing. Because they've forgotten that there was ever anything beneath it. The persona becomes the prison. And even as they're admired, they are alone. No connection, no real intimacy, just echoes bouncing off the walls of a self they no longer recognize. And yet, beneath it all, the shadow still waits, not to destroy them, but to free them. Because Jung knew, you do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And until that moment comes, the narcissist remains adored but hollow, admired but unknown, seen by everyone but never truly seen by themselves. Grandiosity doesn't arrive with a bang. It creeps in quietly, like a drug that promises to erase the ache inside. For the narcissist, admiration becomes oxygen, not because they're vain, but because somewhere deep inside they've forgotten how to breathe without it. The claps, the compliments, the envy of others, they feel like power, but they're not. They're a distraction, a performance on repeat, played louder each time to silence the emptiness beneath. Jung warned us. You inflate the ego when the soul has been silenced. And that's exactly what grandiosity is, an overfed ego screaming over the whisper of a starved soul. At first, it feels like confidence. They walk into rooms and own them. They speak with certainty. They radiate success, beauty, brilliance. But watch closely, it never lasts. Because grandiosity is built on external fuel. And external fuel burns out fast. So they chase more status, more applause, more power. But each achievement is just a sugar rush, and the crash always comes. Deep down, they know. They feel it when they're alone, that nothing ever really touches the place that still hurts, because it was never about being admired, it was about finally feeling worthy. But no amount of validation can fill a wound that was created in silence in the moments when they needed to be loved without performance and were instead asked to shine. And so, they shine. Brighter, louder, more extravagantly than anyone. But the light blinds more than it reveals. It distracts from the truth. They are terrified of being ordinary. Terrified of being unseen, unheard, unneeded. And in that terror, the ego grows, inflates beyond recognition. But ego without soul is unstable. It collapses. Eventually, the applause fades. The crowd moves on. And they're left with the one thing they've spent their whole life avoiding: themselves. That's when the mirror turns cruel. That's when the grand facade cracks. Because grandiosity doesn't heal, it hides. And what is hidden, Jung taught us, doesn't disappear, it returns, louder, angrier, until it's finally faced. Not with pride, but with humility, not with noise, but with silence, and only then can healing begin. Blame is a mirror, not of truth, but of the shadow, and no one uses it more artfully than the narcissist, because the one thing they cannot bear to face is themselves. So they look outward, always outward, and everything they cannot accept within the insecurity, the fear, the envy, the shame they hurl at others like weapons. Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But narcissists don't use that irritation for growth. They use it as escape. Because to reflect would mean to remember, and to remember would mean to feel. So instead, they project. The faults they see in others, their own. The jealousy they accuse you of, theirs. The manipulation they call out, the very game they're playing. It's not strategy, it's instinct. It's survival through deflection. If they can convince themselves that the problem is out there, then they don't have to touch the chaos within. It's why they rewrite stories, twist truths, isolate people, control conversations. It's not just to dominate, it's to maintain a version of reality where they remain untainted, untouched, innocent. Control becomes their shield, and when they feel it slipping, they lash out. Suddenly, you're the villain, you're the problem. You're the one who needs to change, because if they were wrong, even for a moment, the entire structure of their identity would begin to crumble. Projection isn't just denial, it's displacement, a way of taking the unbearable weight of inner conflict and placing it in your hands. And the more you accept it, the more you carry what was never yours to begin with. But here's the truth: what they call you, they fear in themselves. And what they shame you for, they have buried in silence. The narcissist doesn't see you clearly, they see you as a screen onto which their unconscious plays its fears. And unless they choose to stop, to turn inward, to face the shadow, they will live in a world where every mirror reflects blame and never truth, because the truth is far too fragile, far too close. And yet, until they look into that mirror, not of glass, but of self, they will keep living in the illusion that everyone else is broken, and never realize it's their own reflection staring back. Loving a narcissist feels like magic at first, not the subtle kind, the overwhelming kind. The kind that sweeps you off your feet, stares into your soul, tells you you're the one they've waited for. And for a moment, you believe it. You feel seen, chosen, adored. But then, slowly, everything starts to shift. The praise cools, the warmth fades. The eyes that once looked at you like you were everything now scan you with disappointment, and you're left wondering, what did I do wrong? The answer? Nothing. You just entered the cycle. Idealize. Devalue. Discard. It's not love. It's survival wrapped in fantasy. Because the narcissist doesn't fall in love with you, they fall in love with the version of themselves they can see through you. And when that mirror stops reflecting back perfection, they panic. They don't see your humanness as beauty, they see it as betrayal. So they pull away, criticize, withdraw. And you, who once felt like a goddess in their gaze, now feel invisible, confused, starving for the connection that once felt so real. That's the cruelty of it, it did feel real. Because you gave your heart, but they gave you a performance. And yet, empaths, those deeply sensitive, intuitive souls, are often drawn to narcissists like moths to flame. Not out of naivety, but out of hope. You saw the wound behind the mask, the child behind the charm. You thought your love could heal them, but love doesn't heal what isn't acknowledged. You give and give, hoping they'll soften. You stay, hoping they'll remember the beginning, but they don't, because that beginning wasn't love, it was projection. They mirrored your light until they couldn't hold it anymore, and when that mirror cracked, they blamed you for the pieces. The hardest truth? You weren't chosen for who you are, you were chosen for what you could reflect. And once your light began to reveal their shadow, they ran. Not because you failed, but because love, real love, requires presence. And for the narcissist, presence is unbearable, because real love reflects not just beauty, but truth. And they're not ready to see that. Not yet. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." But narcissists don't walk toward the light, they run from the dark, from the shadow, from the wounded parts of themselves they've buried so deep they no longer know they exist. And yet those parts don't disappear, they wait, they grow. And eventually they demand to be seen not as whispers, but as explosions. This is the shadow dance. The tragic choreography of a person who represses their vulnerability only to have it emerge in distorted, destructive ways. The parts they silence, the shame, the insecurity, the fear of being unlovable, become the very things that control them. They deny weakness, but it drives their rage. They hide their pain, but it poisons their relationships. They pretend to be whole, but they fracture everyone they touch. Because what we deny, Jung taught us, doesn't vanish. It becomes our fate. The narcissist's refusal to face their shadow ensures they are ruled by it. And so they cycle through chaos, love turned cold, friendships turned battles, success turned emptiness, again and again, because the wound they won't acknowledge keeps choosing for them. They're not dancing with the world, they're dancing with their reflection, spinning away from the one truth they most need to face. I am not who I pretend to be. And here's the secret. Most never see the shadow isn't evil. It's the part of us that longs to be integrated, healed, seen. The narcissist doesn't have to remain trapped, but the only way out is into the pain, into the memories, into the silence behind the performance. That descent is terrifying. Because for someone who has built their identity on image, authenticity feels like death. But in that death, something real can be born. Individuation, Jung called it, the journey back to the self. Wholeness, not perfection, not applause, just truth. The narcissist will keep dancing beautifully, tragically, until the moment they stop performing and turn toward the mirror, not to be admired, but to finally be honest. That is when the shadow becomes a guide, not a curse. That is when the dance ends and the healing begins. You might think the narcissist fears abandonment, but what they fear even more is being seen, truly seen. Because real intimacy demands more than attention, it demands presence. And presence threatens the entire illusion. The narcissist doesn't just perform for others, they perform for themselves. They need to believe they are who the mask says they are: strong, impressive, untouchable. But love doesn't respect masks, it sees through them, and that is what terrifies them most. Because if someone sees behind the mask, they might see the wounds, the fear, the fragility, and the narcissist has spent a lifetime running from that reflection. Carl Jung warned us, the more we cling to the persona, the more we fear the soul. And for the narcissist, the persona is everything. It's not just a role, it's their protection. So when real intimacy appears, it doesn't feel safe. It feels like exposure, like danger. Because love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability means surrendering control. But control is the narcissist's only safety net. So they sabotage, not consciously, but instinctively. They push people away, pick fights, shut down, flirt with someone new just to feel powerful again. And you, the one who got close, are left confused, heartbroken, trying to understand how something so deep turned so cold. But it's not about you. It's about their terror. Because if you love them, the real them, and then leave, it confirms their worst fear, that they are unlovable. So they leave first, or destroy it, or disappear into someone else's gaze. Anything to avoid the unbearable truth that love cannot be controlled, only received, and receiving is something they never learned how to do. So they stay armored, alone behind a wall of charm and distance, longing to be known, but too afraid to be seen. And until that fear is faced, until the persona is dropped and the soul is welcomed, they will keep running from the very thing they claim to want most: love. The mask can't hold forever. One day, something cracks it, a betrayal, a loss, a failure too big to spin into a story. And suddenly, the narcissist is no longer the center of admiration. The room doesn't respond the same way. The mirror they've relied on stops reflecting. And in that moment, the false self, the one they've spent years, maybe decades, perfecting, begins to collapse. This is narcissistic injury. The psychic wound that cuts deeper than logic can explain. To you, it might look like overreaction, but to them, it's annihilation. Because the identity they've built is so fragile, so inflated, that any puncture feels like death. So they rage, or vanish, or spiral into depression. Anything to regain control. Because without the illusion, who are they? Carl Jung said, what you resist not only persists, but grows stronger. And the narcissist has resisted truth for so long, it now erupts in extremes. One insult becomes war, one mistake becomes collapse. And the self they've denied, the shame, the helplessness, the vulnerability rises like a flood. This is when the narcissist is most dangerous and most lost, because the collapse doesn't just threaten their relationships, it threatens their entire sense of reality. They may lash out, blame everyone, reinvent themselves overnight in an attempt to escape the wreckage, but deep down a voice is whispering, this isn't real anymore. You aren't who you pretend to be. And that voice terrifies them. Because if the mask is gone, and the applause stops, and no one's left to reflect them, then they are forced to sit with the very self they spent their life avoiding. And that's when the real choice appears. Not between success and failure, but between illusion and truth. Between continuing the performance or beginning the descent. Because sometimes, collapse isn't punishment, it's invitation. The first step towards something real, something whole, but only if they choose to stop resisting, only if they're finally willing to face not the world but themselves. This is the question no one wants to ask out loud. Can they change? Can someone who's hurt others, manipulated love, and lived behind a mask for so long truly heal? The answer isn't easy, but it matters. Because behind every narcissist is still a human being lost, fractured, and afraid. Carl Jung believed that true transformation doesn't happen at the surface, it happens in the depths. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And for the narcissist, healing can only begin when they are willing to confront what they've spent a lifetime running from: themselves, not the image, not the persona, the truth. Healing requires the death of the false self, and that's why so few take the path. Because to drop the mask is to lose the only identity they've ever known. It feels like death, like disintegration. But in Jungian terms, it is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the shadow. This is no gentle path. It means facing the abandoned child, the repressed wounds, the parts of themselves they disowned to survive. It means acknowledging the harm they caused, not with excuses, but with responsibility. And most of all, it means learning to sit in silence, without applause, without mirrors, without control, just presence. That is terrifying for the narcissist, but it is also liberating. Because beneath all the performance lies a soul starving for authenticity, a self that was never allowed to breathe, and yes, that self can heal. But only if the person is willing to suffer not others, but themselves. Only if they're willing to break apart in order to come home. Healing is not guaranteed, it's not easy, and it's not fast. But it is possible. And when it happens, when the mask is dropped, the shadow embraced, and the soul remembered, what was once narcissism becomes insight, compassion, depth, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that no longer needs to be seen to know it exists. If narcissism is the art of performance, then modern culture is its perfect stage. Never before have we been so exposed and so unseen. Social media didn't invent narcissism, but it amplified its symptoms. The curated images, the filtered lives, the endless chase for likes, follows, and fleeting admiration. It's not just personal anymore, it's collective. Entire platforms are built around projection, around image over essence. And so, we perform, we post, we compare, we scroll past reality in favor of polished illusions. But underneath all of it, something deeper stirs a hunger, a psychic ache that Jung would have recognized instantly, the hunger to be known, not as a brand, not as a highlight reel, but as a whole, messy, unfiltered self. Yet we fear that truth, because being real in a world of illusion feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability in the digital arena feels like weakness. So we mask, we magnify, we invent versions of ourselves we think will be loved, never realizing we are feeding the very wound that made us perform in the first place. And this isn't just about influencers or fame. It's about ordinary people lonely in crowded comment sections, lost in dopamine loops, addicted to being perceived rather than being present. This is collective narcissism, a defense against emptiness, a culture-wide persona created to distract us from the soul. Jung said, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking." And so much of what we see online is power over our image, over others' perceptions, over our own discomfort. But where is the love? Where is the honesty? Where is the silence? We are starving in a buffet of attention, because what we truly long for can't be filtered or followed. It can only be felt in real connection, in stillness, in truth. If the narcissist hides behind a personal mask, our culture now hides behind a global one. And healing, once again, requires descent. Not into the feed, but into the self, into the shadow, into what's real, not what performs. Because that's where wholeness lives offline, unfiltered and unafraid. It's easy to talk about narcissism as something out there, a label, a diagnosis, a person we once loved and now fear. But Carl Jung reminded us of something more unsettling and far more honest. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. In other words, what we refuse to see in ourselves, we end up seeing and suffering in others. Narcissism isn't just them, it's us. It lives in all of us. Every time we wear a mask to be accepted, every time we reach for validation instead of truth, every time we avoid our own shadow and judge someone else for theirs. Narcissism is a mirror, and sometimes the reflection we're running from is our own. You don't have to be a textbook narcissist to struggle with the same impulses. The hunger to be admired, the discomfort with vulnerability, the temptation to control how others see you. We all do it, especially in a world that rewards image over essence. But the danger isn't in having a persona, it's in forgetting there's a self beneath it. The danger is believing that if we just perform well enough, we won't have to feel the parts of us we've buried. But the shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It grows, quietly, powerfully, until it starts dictating our lives from behind the curtain, and the more we deny it, the more we attract it, in lovers, in bosses, in friends. Not because we deserve pain, but because the soul is relentless in its pursuit of wholeness. It will use whatever reflection it must to wake us up. So maybe the narcissist in your life isn't just a curse. Maybe they're a mirror, not of who you are on the outside, but of what you've exiled within. And that's where the work begins. Not in shaming others, but in owning our own performance, our own fear, our own forgotten self. Because the only way to stop meeting our shadow as fate is to face it consciously, courageously, without looking away. Carl Jung didn't give us easy answers. He gave us paths. And the one he returned to again and again was this: individuation. The journey of becoming your whole self, not the self you were told to be, not the self you pretend to be, but the self that has always quietly existed beneath the noise. This is the true cure for narcissism. Not punishment, not shame, not exile, but integration. Because narcissism is fragmentation. It is living from the surface while the soul starves beneath. Individuation is the reversal of that tragedy. It begins where performance ends in silence, in stillness, in radical honesty. It asks you to stop chasing who you think you need to be, and start listening to who you actually are. And that means meeting the shadow. Not to destroy it, to welcome it. To understand that your anger, your fear, your envy, your shame, they are not flaws, they are invitations. Each one is a message from the parts of you that were exiled to keep the mask intact. Individuation says, let them back in. Let the false self collapse so the true self can finally breathe. Not the self that wants to be seen, but the one that is willing to be known. This is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. Not a curated image, but a full spectrum, the light and the dark, the confidence and the doubt, the clarity and the confusion. The self that doesn't need applause to know its worth. The self that can love without performing, grieve without hiding, speak without manipulating. And the most sacred part? This journey is yours alone. No one can take it for you. No one can validate you into it. The path to individuation is carved in silence and walked in courage. But every step takes you closer to freedom, not freedom from judgment, but freedom from illusion, from the need to be anything other than what you truly are. Because when the shadow is embraced and the mask is dropped, what remains is not emptiness, it's essence, it's truth, and finally, to peace. So here we are, after everything. After the glittering illusion and the hidden wounds, after the applause and the silence that followed, after the masks, the mirrors, the shadow, the fall. What began as a story about them, the narcissists has quietly turned inward, because this isn't just their journey, it's ours. We all know the ache of not being enough. We've all worn the mask. We've all hidden our trembling truth behind a confident smile, hoping someone would love us without needing us to perform. Narcissism isn't just a personality type. It's a defense one we've all used, in moments, to survive. But survival isn't the same as living, and the path Jung left for us, the path of individuation, is the return to life, to depth, to presence. It's the descent into the self, not to become someone new, but to remember who we've always been beneath the noise. Along the way, we've seen the seduction of grandiosity, the pain of projection, the confusion of loving someone who cannot love back, and the mirror those relationships hold up to our own shadows. We've traced narcissism from the wounded child to the false self, from the terror of intimacy to the collapse of illusion. And in all of it, one truth keeps ringing. Healing begins with honesty. Not with perfection, with presence, with the courage to say, I no longer need to be seen to know I exist. That is where the performance ends, and the person begins. It is not easy. It is not glamorous, but it is real. And in a world obsessed with image, there is nothing more radical than authenticity. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That is the journey. From emptiness to depth, from illusion to integration, from persona to essence, from fear to freedom. Because in the end, narcissism is not just the fear of being ordinary, it's the fear of being unseen, unneeded, unloved. But healing begins the moment you realize, being fully yourself is the rarest thing of all, and the most beautiful. The journey doesn't end here. It begins now, not in the eyes of others, but in the mirror you once feared. So look, not to be admired, but to be honest. That's where your life truly begins. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.